Hello everybody and Happy New Year. My name is Bernadette Russell and this is my podcast, How to Be Hopeful, a podcast all about hope, where to find it, how to keep hold of it, how to keep reaching for the light even in the really dark days. And I'm absolutely delighted that my first episode for this brand new year of 2021 is a conversation with my lovely science fiction author friend Paul L Arvidson as we delve into the wonderful world of sci-fi and how it relates to hope. Thank you so much for doing this. So you're going to love this. So as you know, through the good influence of yourself and other very lovely people, I've become sort of really try to engage a little bit more with science fiction, and especially when I was sort of researching the book, because as you know, because we had a lovely chat just before Christmas, didn't we? It's a huge source of hope and optimism. And so my sister and one of my best friends, Sadie, who are massive Star Wars fans, were like, you've got to watch like, I've never seen Star Wars, or I know, it's like, what? How can you even escape that? So my sister insists that I saw the first one, but I can't remember it. So over the Christmas, I've watched A New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, Phantom Menace, Attack of the Clones, Revenge of the Sith, and Solo. And tonight
that is
Rogue
kind
One.
of a marathon.
And I thought I might call our episode May the Force Be With You. Might do. Yeah. So anyway, my darling, would you mind starting out just introducing yourself however you'd like, including the name that you would, because you're a man of several names. So
my name is Paul Arvidson. I am a writer. I do go by several names. I guess my pen name really is Paul L Arvidson, which it seems like I've used for all of my books. I kind of fancied myself as a bit of an Iain M Banks type and put the L in for the science fiction books, and then I decided I quite like the L, so I thought I'd keep it for everything. So yeah, I discovered for years and years and years I've been lying to everybody about how to spell it. The L stands for Lawrence. This is a spoiler. That unique to your podcast. I don't think I've ever revealed that to any of my readers. I'm not sure whether I've revealed it even to my former colleagues, like you were. I'll come to that in a second. So the L is for Lawrence, and I always spelled it Lau or Ence because I quite fancied that, and I thought that was the cool way to spell it. Turns out on my birth certificate it's spelled Lawrence, and I've been lying for years.
I love that. Accidental fibbery.
Accidental fibbery. Yeah. So so I know you from my time with Stan's Calf.
Yeah, I was going to mention. I just wanted to say to everyone listening. So this mysterious man, Paul L Arvidson, is just a fantastically multi-talented, big-hearted, amazing person. Who is a fantastic science fiction writer, but who I met, who's done a series called Dark, which we'll talk about, but who I met when he was basically a magician, which is how I think of lighting designers in theatre, was being a theatre magician by lighting shows beautifully. And we both had a long-term relationship and still do have with a brilliant experimental theatre company based in Birmingham called Stan's Calf. So Paul and I met in making shows together and did a bit of travelling about, didn't we?
We did a lot of that. It was very good. Hence me. I was gonna pop the cork of what I'm drinking live on air, just like as a theatrical effect. But since you're having trouble with the sound from my shonky internet connection from Somerset, I didn't bother. So I've started early. But yes, many a chat round a table with a pint of shandy of some description has been had on many an occasion.
We've had some lovely times. And the journey is so interesting, which hopefully we'll get on to. Before we start, just because it's New Year, it's very early New Year, isn't it? We're actually speaking on the evening of the 2nd, so it's a very newborn year. What are your hopes for this year, if you've dared to have any?
My biggest hope for this year is that people will all come to a realization of what's actually been happening in the past 12 months, as opposed to what they've been being told is happening in the past 12 months. I think what the politicians and the media have been saying has been happening in the past 12 months is vastly different than what people in person have been doing with each other and for each other.
Yeah.
That's been allowing everyone to survive this.
Yeah, yeah.
The reason that we've gotten through it all isn't anything to do with any of the politicians. It's all to do with individual brilliant people and groups of brilliant people acting together in chorus. So all of the stuff that's happened with the vaccine development, my favourite heroic thing in the vaccine development, where that crazy group of people on the internet got themselves together and formed a group and then barracked the Oxford experimenters to be used as guinea pig subjects to bring the speed of the trials forwards. Yeah. So hence we wound up with the Oxford vaccine before before New Year. Yeah. It gets rolled out next week. So but that was people doing stuff. Yeah. And I think that kind of collectiveness and everybody just, there's no way that you could have possibly conceived of doing that without a sense of self-sacrifice and love for each other. Yeah. And I think that's a huge thing. And I think the seeds of that have been sown in the past 12 months. And I think even despite governments not wanting that to happen, for whatever reasons, I'm not sure they do or whether they don't, but whether they do or not, it's irrelevant. I think those seeds are sown now, and I think it's too late for them. I think people are going to just make those things happen because they've liked them happening. Yeah. They've liked people singing together on their front steps, and they've liked clapping for the NHS for the right reasons. Mm-hmm. And I think that's, it's a beautiful thing, and it's we couldn't possibly have had that without the awfulness of 2020. Mm. So I think that's something that's going to go on, whether people want it to or not in the new year, and that's brilliant.
It's incredibly hopeful, isn't it, Arvo? I think it's interesting because I'm sure, like yourself, I saw an outpouring, and I understand it, of people saying good riddance, F off 2020. And actually I thought, I don't feel like that. I don't, and I think really, with given a little bit of distance, nobody will really, because we've learned so much and there's been so much awakening, as you so brilliantly described. Everybody's had different sufferings in different ways, of course, but we've all really gained as well. And we've all sort of learned a lot about ourselves, so that's all brilliant. What a fantastically hopeful expression of last year coming into this year. So yeah, let's keep hold of that. It's going to be super interesting, isn't it, to see what's ahead. So
I think so.
Yeah. So I looked at your website because I wanted to do a bit of I wasn't like being a creepy sort of stalker. I better do a bit of revision, even though you were my good friend. I thought I better check him out.
Well, so, yeah, better right.
Yeah. I'm having technical problems again. I'm so sorry. Right. Yeah, no, it's all right to come back. The internet. Yes, it said...
You're going to have to cope with the slightly shonky internet connection from way down in the deep southwest, I'm afraid. But we've all ganged together as a community, and next year, 2020, or the end of this year, starting next year, they're going to roll out fast fibre broadband for the entire village, but only because we all got together and again barracked them to do it.
That's amazing. Congratulations. That's great. There's some really interesting things going on around here. As a little aside, which I did another podcast about, which about sort of community energy campaigns, like installing solar panels on schools and on church roofs, so that there's a sort of local...
Yeah.
There's interesting things going on, because obviously London's really just a load of villages strung together, really. So at its best,
Yeah.
in a similar way to your village, I hope. So you describe yourself as a 40-something ex-lighting designer who lives in rural Somerset. He juggles his non-author time bringing up his children and fighting against being sucked into his wife's chicken breeding business, which did make me laugh out loud. So there's a lot to talk about there. But I wanted to talk about, if you'll forgive me for the slight cliche, your origin story, which I don't know, even though I've known you for a long time. And I just wondered, as little Paul growing up, was science fiction always something that you were interested in? And if you could talk a little bit about that yourself.
So in the same way that you swatted my website, I've kind of I swatted your questions and then kind of and I know you gave them to me just to avoid blindsiding me, but we've known each other for so long that it wouldn't really feel that way anyway. So I always feel like you could have asked me anything and could ask me anything and tear the sheet up and ask me a random set of different things, and it wouldn't matter. But I went back and so I kind of read them all and let them stew for a little bit, and then went back and reread them today to remind myself, just to see what it all stirred up. And I thought I was going to ask you back, were we talking about literary science fiction, or were we talking about any kind of cultural science fiction? And I I don't know, I guessed you were going to say either.
Yeah, I think any, really, because I think, I think any, because it's quite, what's really brilliant, I suppose, about being a kid is you're allowed loads of entry points. You give yourself permission to kind of access it, whether that's comics or graphic novels or films or, however, really. I guess I'm interested in the various brilliant ways that kids find to escape and explore. And science fiction is just such a brilliant arena of escape and exploration. I just wondered how that started for you, really. It's the beginning of your journey to becoming a sci-fi writer.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm trying to think of my earliest memories of it, and I think, I mean, my mother always says she remembers watching the moon landings while she was heavily pregnant with me. I was born in '69, but I was born in the November, so all the moon landing shenanigans all happened late that summer. So she remembers being heavily pregnant with me whilst watching all of that. So whether that's been a weird influence on me or not, I don't know. But the first TV I remember kind of sticking in my head from that really, really formative kind of era when I guess when you're too young for things to make all that much sense, and then weird things stick in your head, and then those weird things come back to revisit you and haunt you later on, were things like all that kind of slightly wobbly setted like television, uniquely British television science fiction. So things like obviously Doctor Who, that's got all that kind of really odd curiosity to it. That kind of, it's definitely science fiction, but it's got that kind of, there's a weird oddness to it. And so all of those other things that were around at the same time, like all those kind of live action things that Jerry Anderson did, like Space 1999, which I know was a lot later, but things like UFO was the one that was out at the time, was a massive science fiction thing then, but it's really quirky and cult now. Nobody's heard of it, but it had that kind of, again, that kind of very weird kind of British television sci-fi oddness to it, but it was set in this kind of in a way that Doctor Who isn't. It was set in this kind of beautiful, shiny future world where everyone had like really nice suits and posh cars, and all the women had like fantastic outfits and looked really slick and had kind of purple hair, and it was very cool. But it was odd as well. The oddness was something that stuck. The aliens in it, although they're very human, because it's cheapest to do that in kind of wobbly set sci-fi, I guess. But they were strange. There was strangeness about them, and I just loved all of that. It was kind of odd.
It's funny today. This is a very different world, really. But I was part of this Mummers Festival online, which is happening this weekend, and there's sort of festival on Monday. But I don't know if you're aware of what Mummers plays are about as far from science fiction as you can get, but they occupy that really weird, folky, weird, odd, wobbly setness that where the stories misbehave and they don't really have a proper beginning or an end sometimes, really, and also they're a bit sort of naughty. So that 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 appeals to me. That kind of.
Well, I love all of that, and I think that idea of um, of Mummers plays kind of, that they create. I mean, there's a rough idea of where the story's kind of supposed to go, but whether it gets there or not is entirely dependent on the group of mummers, the audience, how many shandies everyone's had, and and all that kind of stuff. And it just explodes out of nowhere, and I love all of that stuff. And I guess also the idea that that science fiction in some kind of a way owes itself back to all of those original medieval medieval mystery plays and the mummers plays, where where it comes from this idea of like, right, we're going to imagine what hell is, and then you'd have, insane carpenters on mushrooms designing you a wagon that, that burst into flames and, and had Satan's mouth that everyone crawled into and devils and demons, and there's all that kind of really trippy, mad stuff that went on. The same kind of art that winds up in in gargoyles and pewends and mad things like that. That it's just this complete otherworldly stuff. And before science fiction was a thing, before utopias were a thing, that's where all of that comes from, isn't it?
That's so brilliant, making that link. It's very sort of pleasing to make that. It makes a lot of sense. I'm very interested. I've been over this strange period that we've all lived through. I've become more and more fond of saying there are some things that metaphors are better for, which pleases me. It's a really small poem, but I'm sort of serious. I've been sort of thinking about how, although I read a lot of non-fiction and I'm sort of really interested in science, etc., the same as you, but I kind of think these times are so huge and the challenges are so massive that actually the myth and sci-fi and folk tales and weird tales are kind of a really useful way of trying to understand what's going on. Does that make sense to you?
It absolutely does. I mean, the weird thing about lockdown for me has been stories. Stories have kind of held my life together, if you like, through lockdown. I've kind of been frantically trying to hammer together the third book in the trilogy for me, the third book in my sci-fi trilogy. I mean, I've written other little novellas in the same universe, but the third of the big three books. And I've been struggling to try and keep my brain together to write, and anybody who's tried to do anything that requires any concentration during lockdown will know what I'm talking about when I say this. There's almost like a lockdown brain thing where it's so difficult to focus because the world's been so mad outside. But the needing to tell a story is just so important, and that kind of thing in itself has just kept me together, kind of getting up and doing a regular little writing stint, even if I only, sit and stare at the screen for half an hour and write 200 words or 100 words or whatever, has been really important. It's kind of threaded my lockdown together. And then in the evenings, I've been doing a number of mad different Zoom things. One of which is for a group called Swan UK, that's close to my heart. I'm the I kind of loosely organise a group for all the dads of these families. And it's basically us getting together once a week and shooting the breeze, and and talking about what's happened and what have you. But it's basically telling our own stories. And then to bookend either of those things, I've been doing like online role playing. So one of them is a fantasy version of all of that, where I've built a world for some of my friends to play in. And then the other one is a science fiction one where I literally get to go and crack a few beers and pretend to be a space rat for 2 hours on a Thursday. And it's but it's and it's been and those things have been, and it's kind of really felt like I've been able to fly my nerd flag high really in lockdown, because it's kind of like there were a couple of my friends who I invited who used to play as teenagers, and I said, oh, we're getting together and doing this and having a few beers, and there were just a couple of them were a bit sniffy about it, and I kind of thought, wow, okay, when did they grow up? When did they when did they become grown-ups?
But when did they decide they didn't need that? It's strange. I
Yeah.
love all of that, and I think that allowing it's a really beautiful description of what I tried to do as well, which is use storytelling in all the possible ways. So use it as in helping people tell their real story, and everyone's story is important, and you're not alone. And that kind of therapeutic space is really beautiful, I think, that you have with swans, and also this sort of escape, or it's not even escape, it's like a way of exploring a problem, isn't it? And just going back to science fiction, for me, why I'm very grateful for your encouragement in exploring it. It's like it's become more and more important to me, fantasy and science fiction, because I'm like, actually, we are in crises, and it's not necessarily negative crises. It feels like there's this spiritual evolutionary crisis going on, human evolutionary crisis, which is about, let's try and imagine what we could do instead of getting sunk into gloom. And so sci-fi and fantasy serves that really well. The world that I feel serves that really well. And I wondered if, in your much broader overview of it as a sort of genre, do you think that it kind of tends to be literary sci-fi, tends to be intrinsically hopeful, or do you think there's a larger piece of that pie that is dystopian?
I thought this was one of the crux questions, really.
Yeah.
And I've kind of.
Is it? If it's impossible to answer, honestly, because I know it's.
No, I don't think it is. But whether you'd asked me yesterday or asked me when you first sent me the questions, I don't know whether there'd have been a different answer.
Yeah.
And I think maybe there'd be a different answer. Every time you asked me, I think very much that I think the reason that there is so much dystopia is easier to write. If you're going to sit down and imagine a future world, then you can't help but take as your starting point where we are now. And God knows, what are you going to write this year? After having experienced last year, when the world has gone bananas and there are politicians who are literally crackers and actually lying to you through their teeth on television, or in this country, worse still, politicians who aren't even bothered lying to you anymore. That is just insane. What kind of world are you going to fashion in your mind if you use that as a starting point? So dystopia is always easier to write. So in many ways, kind of having been brought up on a theatre improvisey, we're doing it because it's hard background.
Yeah.
Then that's where I don't want to go. I want to make sure I'm writing something that's hard as opposed to something that's easy. So I write. So I try and write, and I think it's easy to argue that the books that I've written aren't utopian. per se. And I guess how much we want to go into actual details in the books or not, it's up to you. The idea that the characters in the book are searching for utopia and they're striving to make their world a better place, I think is a very, very common trope in sci-fi, even when things are, you can see from the obvious arc that things are going to go wonky. I'll take for an example, how do people on your podcast feel about spoilers for classic books?
I think all right. We'll say now there's going to be some spoilers.
Okay. I might not spoil mine, but I'll spoil somebody else's. Well, this is H.G. Wells, so he's not going to sue me. So the time machine, H.G. Wells' time machine, has got this kind of idea. Once he's got his time machine working, and it's all working fantastically, and he's been and seen dinosaurs, and he's gone back in time and done all of that bit. He then does what everybody with the time machine would do and goes forward into the future to see what it's like there. And the future is this kind of beautiful, shiny place where everyone wears white suits and has enough to eat and everything's all jolly and happy and lovely. And of course, anybody who's ever watched anything knows what's going to happen next. The jolly and lovely is all on the backs of somebody else, and he kind of discovers that the jolly and lovely is on the back of the poor Murgos who are buried underneath the ground and do mining and working and making food and making the world the beautiful place that it is. And so there is a utopia there, but it's kind of but there's that trope of people exploring making the world a better place is has always been there. Things like Brave New World, where where the discussion of the whole thing is how would you have a utopian world, or if you had this framework of a utopian world, would it still work, and how would those, in a way, Huxley kind of explores that throughout the book, and it looks to me, I don't know very much about how he wrote it and his thought processes while he was writing it. I tend not to get into that if I can help it, because I'd rather let books like that stand on their own. But it feels to me, having read the book, like he's trying to explore those ideas while he's going through it, and the conclusion he comes to at the end of it is different than the framework he set up at the beginning. And so it's kind of there's all kinds of strange, hopeful things that happen in the book, as well as awful things. But there are strange, hopeful things that are kind of spun out of the way the characters interact and how his setup plays out, if you like. So I think there's a lot of different science fiction stories like that have that baked into them, if you like. So the idea that that technology and those things are always a double-edged sword. So if it's if you start out with a world that that is intrinsically bad, actually that technology has got another edge to it. So there's always good that balances that out.
Yeah, I've got a long way to go. It's a bit like deciding you're going to sort of try and find out about opera from the big world, and I know it is. But one thing that as a person, I'm a very earthy person. Like I like literally getting my hands dirty and walking in the woods. And I find a lot of science fiction, and I'm sure there are exceptions, but one of the sort of things that puzzles, I'm like, none of this is ever about the planet. They're always zooming around and fighting over territory, and I haven't really finished my thinking about that, except that I think I'd be interested in finding science fiction that is a little bit more connected with sort of the natural worlds, whatever those worlds are. Like, I suppose it's because I've done this big stint of doing lots of Star Wars, and I do really like it, but it is kind of battles and technology, and quite a lot of the landscapes, interestingly, don't have any kind of nature in the tools. That's I'm like, that's kind of interesting, you know, and how much the philosophy of that, like battling each other, battling for territories, battling because there's not enough of everything, fighting over power. But what I like is that I understand that in a way, if we wrote about utopia, that would be the end of the story, wouldn't it? That's the happily ever after. And that's where it leaves you, so that in order for there to be a story, there has to be sort of conflict. But I think what I've enjoyed is that there is always hope. And what I've loved is there's this real sort of hope punk kind of against all of the odds, despite the fact that we're probably going to lose, we're still going to kind of try. And that feels like a really important, pertinent message for now. Do you?
Yeah, I do. And I also think let me add you a writing reference at this juncture.
Lovely.
If you've not read any Ursula Le Guin yet,
did she write Earthsea? Did she write?
Did she write?
Was it something called Earthsea?
Yes,
I've got that, but I haven't read it. I've got that. Yeah.
That's fantasy. But she also wrote some incredible science fiction books and incredibly beautiful work. And she comes to it all from the point of view of kind of anthropology, if you like. She's more interested in kind of what people would do under those circumstances, and how, you know, how the planet might shape people, or people shape the planet, and how all these people might interact. And she has this fantastic theory that my wife introduced me to, about the theory of what your first tool would be. And she very much has this as kind of the root of almost all of her science fiction, if you like. The idea that, you know, if you and I guess this is going to be terribly sexist to say, so you can pull me up on it if you want. But the idea that if you're going to let a bloke loose writing a book, then the very first tool that, you know, that the protagonist in that book's going to have is going to be a spear. And Ursula Le Guin reckons that actually, if you leave a tribe to their own devices, the very first technology they're going to come up with will be a bag to carry stuff in. Yeah, you know, so the idea that, you know, if you're going to be a tribe and you're going to go anywhere or do anything, then you've got to take all your stuff with you, you know, all your vital. Yeah. So, you know, so her idea that the first, you know, your first tool is a basket, not a weapon. The, you know, that taking that as a start instead is really, really interesting. And then kind of, you know, builds a different world, and it's just kind of taking that spin on it that, you know, well, actually, what if you started the world this way around instead of that way around?
That's a really interesting thing you brought up, because I suppose I was thinking, and, you know, I'm at the very beginning thinking about this, but I was thinking it's connected, isn't it, to the importance of having a really broad range of storytellers. So particularly, I think, with science fiction, so we've got, you know, we have a sort of queer perspective, we have different people from different belief system backgrounds, different ethnicities, different religions, different nationalities, I guess. And so that all sort of, and you know, working class voices, and so it's not all the same kind of voice. Not that there's anything wrong with the voices that exist, I'm not trying to say that, but just that helps, I suppose, like you were saying, having a woman write, it's not going to be a better story, but it's going to be a different perspective, the same way as, you know, a gay man might write a different perspective. So
yeah, and in a way, you know, kind of that's what I want in a book, in a way, is, you know, is kind of, you know, I want, you know, in books and theatre, you know, and films, and, you know, in everything, and all those creative things. I mean, you know, everybody wants things that are safe, you know, and I recognise why people have wanted that in the past 12 months. But sometimes, you know, I want to be shaken up a little bit, you know, and I want a different spin on something, you know, and I think when you're, you know, when you're wanting a different skew on the world and a different perspective on the world, you know, just science fiction is where it all springs up from. And there are these kind of eruptions of different things. So the Ursula Le Guin thing there was a whole kind of burgeoning of like feminist science fiction in the 70s and 80s, and there was just this like incredible stuff where there was just this base of a different perspective and a different way to tell a story, and it clashed massively with all those kind of golden age science fiction people like Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov, who, you're quite right, were quite scientific and quite rarefied, and it was all about like science must be correct, it must be believable, and whereas actually her stuff, was a lot more imaginative and a lot more, it came from a different place, and then it went through to a point where there were kind of extremely kind of punky kind of feminist writers, feminist science fiction writers like Joanna Russ, who wrote this amazing book called The Female Man, and it's just this blistering book, and it feels like some kind of it feels like the science fiction equivalent of Courtney Love, the kind of somebody, or Hole, or somebody kind of like screaming into the microphone, and it's just brilliant, and it's breathtaking, and it's beautifully done and beautifully written. But again, it's that other sideways perspective that makes, and I think science fiction allows all of that all the time. There's always it's always fertile soil for new ideas to spring from, I think.
Yeah, it makes me think of that. I'm going to horribly misquote this, so I apologise, but there's a poem by Robert Browning in which he talks about stretching for things that are impossible, which made me think about science fiction. It's something like a person's reach should exceed their grasp. And I think there's something really beautiful about that in science fiction sometimes. So when it isn't particularly respectful of existing scientific possibilities, when it is rebelliously disrespectful of what is actually possible right now and dares to imagine the impossible, I find that really interesting, because I think it's really helpful. And I'm sure as well there are things that have been invented and copied from science fiction ideas, because science fiction is, I'm sure some that that ideas have been dreamt up that have then, the children that have become the inventors and physicists and cosmologists of the future have tried to make possible, or at least explored. So I find that really hopeful in sci-fi as well. It's like, yeah, and also there's something really courageous and about imagining a utopia-ish future. Not perfect, not brilliant, or even imagining a future dystopia where you've got, as you described, Arvo, those sort of plucky people who still fight on regardless. That feels really heroic to me, like imaginatively heroic. Given that, do you feel that? Oh, there's one thing I want to speak to you about is one thing that you recommended to me, and honestly, my reading list is so long, I still, to my shame, haven't got round to it. But it's been discussed could you help me with my book, which I'm really grateful for, and you spoke really brilliantly and really excited me about this idea of a post-scarcity world, and the post-scarcity world that was explored by Iain M. Banks, who we mentioned earlier. And that sort of really interested me, and I keep coming back to it. I made a show actually during Zoom called The House That Slipped, in which I played a character who occupied a post-scarcity future in Deptford, and that's entirely down to my conversation with you. Yeah. I had a really good week. You'd have been proud of me, and some horns. That was quite good, and and a silver top. So, but I was really thought about that, and I thought actually, well, you'll describe it better, but as you described it, this world in which needs are met, and the sort of drudgery of this sort of work has been replaced by machines, so we've got time to be creative and stuff. That really excited me, and I thought that's possible, isn't it? So I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, because I did buy Iain M. Banks books, but I have, as you can imagine, quite a pile of to read to do. But I just wanted to let you know that I've been a really positive influence on me, and I found that a really hopeful thing to reach for. It doesn't seem impossible.
No, and once you get into reading one of them, I mean, if I were you, I would start with Player of Games and go from there.
And is it the series is called? What?
The world is called the culture.
That's it, the culture.
And so all of those, well, not all of those, most of those Iain M. Banks science fiction stories take place in the culture. I would start with Player of Games because it's the lightest and easiest to read, and it's just a really good read. It's really easy to get into, and it lays open a lot of the things that he started exploring in the earlier books about what a utopia would be and how you would get it established, and what some of the fallout of everybody living in a utopia would be. It's my favourite, and I batter on about Iain M. Banks to anybody who'll sit and listen for long enough. That because I love the idea of the utopia that he's created, and I also, aside from loving the idea of of us striving for utopia anyway, and kind of why not? Why shouldn't we choose or make a world where nicer things happen? We don't have to accept a world where things are crap. We can individually and collectively choose not to do that. We don't have to listen to anybody else who tells us to hate other people. We can individually and collectively ignore that and all. And so that's what he does in his universe. And the interesting thing about it that you brought up before is that, how do you produce conflict in a world where everything's perfect?
Yeah.
And in a way, that's my favourite of his books, because in Player of Games, there's a game, but there's no. Well, you need to read it and find out. I'm not prepared to spoil that one, but there is. But there is. It's about that. It's about, in this perfect world, how do you write a story that has drama in it? Do you need to have conflict in it to have a story that's interesting and compelling and has interesting characters and has a plot that drives from from one end to the other? And actually, yeah, it's dead easy. Well, it's not easy, but it's but it's doable. It's very doable. And so I'm fascinated by those kind of books now, and there aren't very many of them out there where where it's set in a utopia, and then you still have that dramatic drive in the plot, to get people to to drag people through it from or to engage people so that they drag themselves through it, to from beginning to end. I think the other thing about that as a good start point for his work in particular is that there's a lot of good stuff in it that comes up in his world quite a lot. So there's alien races in it that are that are quite alien. There are machines and computers and robots in it, in the way that Iain M. Banks does those, because he calls those things minds, and he's, rather than having a computer be an automaton or a clockwork creature, these things have gone past the point of their own genesis, if you like, and so you're talking about kind of some of these minds can create other minds. So it's kind of it's artificial intelligence that can create more artificial intelligence without us needing to be there. And so it explores those ideas of what would happen if if artificial intelligence was so clever, then he posits, why would something that was so clever want to destroy something? Why is something that why would something that is so clever want to destroy a planet? Or why is something that is so clever and so wise, why would something like that want to do anything other than things that are creative and productive?
That's so brilliant. It's so it's brilliant, and it's radical.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's really radical, and that was what I enjoyed about it. I mean, that's why I like Banks's writing. Full stop. Is that it is radical, and that's such a radical idea. And and he even he's very careful to cover his own tracks and write his own alibi as he goes. Because the flip side of that is is the classic sci-fi trope of robots going mad. Perm any science fiction story that you like. There's usually one there with crazed robots or crazed computers, isn't there?
It
But he
goes
kind of
back. It's funny in a funny way. I thread it right back to Frankenstein,
yeah
isn't it? It kind of sort of fear of loss of control in our own inventions, or something, or fear of development, or yes.
yeah. Well, and a lot of people forget, and you clearly don't because you're familiar with that work, which a lot of the science fiction community consider to be the first real actual science fiction book in the truest sense of the word, and some would argue still the best. That it has that kind of what if supposition, but it also it takes that what if supposition to its logical conclusion. And I don't find the monster monstrous, which is, I guess, her full intention for the book. The monsters in Frankenstein are us. The people who meet the monster and treat it badly, are the real monsters. And so the idea that you're dead right, the idea that he is your original android in a way, the kind of the created the creative the man created by man without birth.
Do you think?
He's absolutely that, isn't he? And
I think so. Yeah, I've never actually had that thought before this conversation, but it feels like a really pleasing thread. Do you think that do you think it's always fear that makes monsters of us? Because I think I do. I think I do. I know fear is sometimes useful. Obviously, like it's useful to be scared of not jumping off the edge of a cliff. They're a useful. I understand that I'm not that fear is useful and essential for survival, but I have thought about it so much in the last few years, and when I see people behaving badly, if I stop myself getting annoyed at them and think for a moment, it always feels like it's fear that's made them angry, or fear that's made them hate, or fear that's made them into monsters. And I wonder whether that connects to, we're frightened of androids, we're frightened of Frankenstein's monsters, they're frightened of us, we're all frightened of each other, and we're fighting. And whether I just, yeah, I often think that fear's the enemy, really.
I think you're right. And I think one of the um, the most compelling things about science fiction in a way, and the reason that I keep taking myself back to it, because I occasionally have times where I don't read it. Um, so I kind of come away from science fiction and fantasy, and go and read a good encyclopedia, I don't know. But from time to time, but only occasionally, and I always come back to it because that whole thing of the way science fiction. Um, I'm going to badly quote this now. Somebody famous science fiction related and brilliant wrote about the idea of science fiction holding a mirror up to us. Might have been Carl Sagan. The science fiction is a story that holds a mirror up to ourselves. And so the in a way, all of those aliens, those your cyborgs and your little green men and all of those ideas of the alien are us in the mirror. And it science fiction allows us to look in that mirror, in a safe environment, I guess. And looking in that mirror, as often as possible and as regularly as possible, I think really helps us as humans, I guess.
I I do, yeah, I agree, and it sort of leads on to mine. I mean, again, I know this is a big question in a way, but I'm interested in to what extent all of the arts can be expected to and can contribute positively. So, in terms of science fiction as a genre, over literary science fiction and popular culture, films, etc., do you feel that it can actually practically help and contribute towards positive change and progression in terms of human evolution? Do you think we can expect it to do that, or is it just about escape and entertainment, which is also, of course, absolutely fine, and serves all sorts of other things like just comfort and having a laugh?
Yeah, I really think it can. I really think it can. I think the idea that see, I think once you've dipped your toe in the science fiction pond, um, then you've got a wet toe, haven't you? That's you your your toe your toe is then wet, and yeah, and you know what you do then? You know, do you make your whole foot wet? Well, you might do. You might go back, and you've now discovered that a wet toe is not the worst thing in the whole world, and you might go and put two toes in next time. And the idea is that whole thing, you know, if the last thing that you watched was Star Wars, Star Wars has got a, and it varies in its quality and its storytelling. Don't get me wrong. However, and I believe that in the order that you've chosen to watch them, by the way, you're watching Rogue One last is definitely the correct way around. You're leaving the best till last, I think. Although also the Mandalorian's very good.
Yeah, I think I've got that to come. So I've taken
Yeah,
advice from the experts in the field, and I'm watching them in the sort of the correct order in terms of timeline, rather than the order that
I
they
think
go.
that's beautiful.
Yeah, I've followed the wisdom.
Yeah, I think it's good. I think it's good. But you can't possibly watch Star Wars without then having some of that kind of slightly faux sage wisdom going on in the background either. And some of that stuff is actually quite sensible. You know, the idea about fear leading to evil and the dark side and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
It's actually,
I love it. I love it. Yoda says some incredibly, like, really genuinely powerful things, and I love his sort of experimental syntax. Just love it. Just it's so endearing. Love Yoda. I said he's like a cross between Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Buddha.
he kind of is, isn't he? He kind of is, especially if I think that's the benefit of the of of the the full series of films is that if you've not watched the first three more recently shot ones, then you'd never see Yoda go ninja on somebody's ass, and I think that's quite worth watching for the sake of it. Watching Yoda boing round and batter people is great fun. Not that I advocate violence. It's just the spinning round and jumping up and down for him. It's very
Just
good.
brilliant. I like seeing the little people win as well, because he's quite a small person, isn't he? I just wondered if there are any ideas in any of your favourite science fiction books or films, actually, that you would like us to see as sort of actually Nick for the real world. Are there anything? Given that you've been
Yeah.
talking about how science fiction actually is a really useful sort of tool for us in imagining a brighter future, is there anything that's already been written that you're like, yeah, we should have that?
Yeah. One of my favourites from Ian M. Banks is the idea that because um, because genetic technology has advanced so far and so fast, that we're kind of witnessing now. We're kind of seeing those things kind of full speed while we're living through 2020. But the thing that he posits in the kind of utopia is that having gone through all the books that it's possible to read super fast because you can spool them into your brain, and having listened to all the music it's possible to listen to and watched all the films it's possible to watch, what else are people going to get up to? And obviously, everyone's got all these kind of that people choose whatever relationships they've got. So they have open relationships if they want to. They have enormous big kind of sub-family relationships if they want to, or they live on their own as hermits if they want to. And then kind of moving on from that, he then decides that, well, you'd probably use genetic technology to change gender if you fancied. So so some of the people in his books have gone from being a man to a woman. Some people have gone from being a man to a woman and back again. Some people have gone from either gender to being neutral, and people can just change as they fancy. So you can change so I could change from being a man to a woman, have children, and then change back. Or, you could change from a woman to a man, give children to somebody else, not have to bear them yourself, and change back. And so there's all the kind of, the practical human aspects of all of that. But also there's the, I've never had a shag as a woman. That would be really interesting, And so the idea that humans would explore that, and the idea that kind of the shitstorm of a year we've gone through this year, with people kind of people hating on each other, and there being kind of series of things where it's boiled down to people hating on each other for whatever reasons, gender diversity being one of them. The idea that that a technology would just render all of those ideas utterly redundant is just great. I just like the idea of that, like a technology removing the rug from the entirety of that argument and saying, well, actually, everyone's just people. And we all just get along.
I absolutely love that. What an extraordinary imagination. Is it Orlando, the novel?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Is that a Virginia Woolf? I feel like that's Virginia
Woolf. Yeah, it is.
So, I mean, that's an interesting exploration, isn't it? I think anything that helps us sort of unpack that angry knot, sometimes seems to be quite an angry knot, would be a really fantastic thing. Do you remember which of his books he explored the gender idea?
It happens in a few of them. I think. Okay. I think one of the characters in I think it's just dropped in kind of. I don't think he ever did it as an arc as one of the books, which I think is a shame in a way. It'd be really lovely to go back and explore that. But loads of the characters just mention it. It's like, oh yeah, that 20 years ago. Yes, I was. That's when I was a girl, and then and then they changed back again.
I just love the idea of that, Arvo, from the point of view of helping us be compassionate and helping us with empathy. Because actually, if I understood the experience of being in a different kind of body, whatever that was, whether that's gender or a different physical reality, that would be amazingly helpful. Obviously, it's good to do the work to be empathetic and compassionate. Of course it is, but actually there's nothing like actually knowing what that's like.
Yeah, totally.
Wow, that's mind-blowing. That's brilliant. I want to just get on to talking about your amazing work so that people can hear about it actually, and also to sort of talk a little bit about your journey, because you have a beautiful trilogy and I think various offshoots centred around a world that's set in the dark. And I know you and I have spoken about this before, and I want to talk about the book with you, but for me it's just absolutely brilliant that you had this amazing career as a professional theatre lighting designer, and your work was about light, providing light, being godlike in your creating light as an artist, and then your fictional world is set in the dark. So what's that about? Was that a sort of deliberate choice, or did you set out writing in the dark and then was like, oh, that's interesting?
That's exactly what happened. I'd written the first one, and then it was only when I was going back and editing it. So I wrote the first one. I think I started. There were kind of ideas of it going around my head in the long dark nights of child feeding between the two kids. So that would have been 2007, 2008.
I should say you've got two kids. Are they 2 years apart?
1 year apart, just. Yeah, 13 months. Yeah.
So that was really heavy duty parenting, bleary eyed,
Yeah.
not much sleep. And that was the point at which I think I'm right in saying you sort of stopped. It's really difficult to do theatre when you've got little kids, I think, isn't it? Was that when...
Well, we soldiered on and kind of tried to carry on doing it for as long as humanly possible.
Yeah.
And I it was a little bit like one of those episodes of Hornblower where, when he gets on the boat, it's been holed beneath the waterline. And so it's only an inevitability that the boat is going to sink. It's just a matter of time before it does. And so the idea that much parenting can be done with one pair of hands, and I kind of take my hat off to any single parent who manages that with one pair of hands, because God knows, it's tough enough with two pairs of hands. And so as a partnership, kind of, we slogged through it and struggled through it, and just slowly but surely, in my younger daughter's early life, we started to realize that her condition was quite complicated. So she started missing milestones and things like that. And slowly but surely, we realized that hers wasn't going to be a normal childhood. And as her care became more and more complicated as we got further on, it just became more and more and more unsustainable for me to be having a life out on the road. And so I slowly but surely whittled down all the stuff I was doing. And I started giving up theatre stuff a lot earlier, because longer hours and less pay for the idea that, if I've got to be out there doing something to bring a crust in, I need to be spending as few hours out of the house as humanly possible. So I wound up doing all the corporate stuff instead, which, you can make that quite creative, but it's the more I did that and the less I did the theatre stuff, the more I realised that if I didn't have a creative outlet, I'd go crackers. And so I started taking the stuff that was an initial scribblings about this world, and finally made them into a book. And it was only really once I think Dark came out in 2014, and I think so it was only when I came to edit that, which was back into 2012, 2013. Took me ages to do anything. That I looked back at the book again, and then went, oh, I've set this. I've spent the last 5 years slowly giving up, a career that a career that I loved, a vocation, if you like, and then I've set the entirety of this book in the dark. Is this me sticking two fingers up at the universe? And I guess in a way, on one level, it is. And I guess people have asked me where the book came from, and that's definitely it. It came out of my subconscious without a shadow of a doubt. I didn't set out to make it, like that, and I didn't set out for it to be the story of the anti-me. But once I'd written the thing, I went back and looked at it and thought, shit, that's why I wrote it like that. But for me as a writer, it was very much just like an interesting science fiction posit, or an interesting, creative posit. What would happen if, if you had a world that was totally set in the dark, would it work? Would it function?
Could you introduce us to it, just in case people are listening? Because I know there's going to be people sort of interested in reading your stuff. I don't know if it's possible to sort of do a kind of summary of what to expect from your trilogy.
So it's the two things that I had the idea that would it be possible to have a world that had heroes and adventures in the dark if there was no light at all. So there's not, you occasionally get it happen in films, but you can't make a film with no light. That's not a possible thing. So they've got to fudge it. But in a book, you don't have to fudge it. You can have there be zero light at all. And I like the idea of having an unusual set of rules for your book, or any creative endeavor. I like those things with an unusual set of rules. It makes slightly bonkers things that I really enjoy.
Yeah.
So all of those kind of, the idea that people imagine that the devising is very much like, you throw everything into the air, and actually that makes a terrible devise piece. Whereas actually what most pro devisers tend to do is kind of say, right, the rules for this game are this, and those are the things that make the magic happen. And so in a way, that was me just doing that as a, it's the kind of the creative way I know how to work, if you like, and that's where I started from, with that idea of darkness, and would that, would complete darkness work as a setting? So having started that and having done a few little explorations of how that might function, and little character sketches and little scene sketches and all that kind of stuff, I then kind of had this like little voice in the back of my head that permanently bothers me about any kind of culture that I take in that no matter what it is, it's got to be accessible, I guess. I think all the best things are still accessible to everybody.
I agree.
So no matter how brilliant and how clever it is, it's the accessibility that then that gives the life to it, I guess. Yeah. And ultimately I'm looking to try and make a living out of these books. So, I'd actually like, some people to buy some. So, so
I agree with you. I think it's an expression of ambition to want things to have a wide reach and to not be elitist in that way, to reach out to lots of people is really ambitious. And I think you're absolutely right as well. It doesn't mean that it has to not be clever or not be high concept or whatever. So I think it's really brilliant.
And I think my favourite science fictions that I've ever read have had both of those things. Like Isaac Asimov, for all the fact that he's brilliant, I find him really difficult to read because it's really, really dry. It's really sciencey, and it's just the story just never grabs me. Whereas, a slightly different tilt on that is the way Arthur C. Clarke does things sometimes. Yeah. In the story of 2001, although it's got a beautiful science arc to it, actually it's about astronauts escaping from a ship that's gone bonkers, and for unspecified spoiler reasons, and so so there's still it's an exciting story, and it's the story of those characters, and the survivor, and how the survivors kind of make their way through the story. And so it's that thing, the idea that you can write something weird in a science fiction universe and still have it compelling, I think is the thing. So I wanted to make it unlike anything anybody's read before, but also really easy to read and easy to get into, and really, really driven by the characters, and to have the characters relatable, despite the fact that they're on an alien planet. The idea that they just have a life, and they have
sort of connect with them. And you're on you're finishing up the third of the trilogy right now. Is that right?
I managed to sneak it into the back end of 2020.
Wow.
I managed to write the end on the 31st.
What? That's amazing.
I was very pleased. I was it was a little bit like racing to the finish tape. I was determined to get to the end of it. And I just about managed to squeak it in. I was very pleased.
And where is the best place for people to buy it from, and what formats is it in, and how do we get hold of it and access it?
Well, I mean, your best jumping off point, I guess, is the website, which is www.paularvidson.co.uk.
Easy.
Yeah, just me. And on there are all, there are all of the links to all of the books are all there. You can get them in all e-formats. So whatever you're a reader of, if it's iBooks or if it's Kindles or Kobos or whatever, get it on all of those. You can also get it on Audible. One of the things I was really conscious of, there's quite an interesting take on my books from a couple of people who've read them, who've been visually impaired, and it's an entirely different spin. I was terrified of the first review I got from somebody who was that I'd made some kind of god awful clangor, but touch wood. And so the idea that it didn't have an audio version of it seemed to me to be bonkers, but it took me a long while to get down to the production of doing that, because it's quite, I mean, you'll know yourself, having done those kind of productions, it's a massive undertaking, so it's kind of takes a long time. It took me a while to get that underway. Hopefully now they should be getting rolled out almost as fast as people will buy them. So the first one's available on Audible. The second one is in Audible's engine, and it will be released as soon as they tell me it's ready. The third one, I might do one of the shorter ones, because there's little novellas as well. So I might do one of the novellas. I decided in a moment of insanity that like having protagonists in a world set entirely in the dark wasn't quite enough. Could I make a detective story in all that universe? So the novella is that.
I think novellas lend themselves really well. I listen to a lot of audio actually, and novella's great actually, because sometimes podcasts aren't quite enough and novels are a little bit too much for me.
Yeah.
But I think novella's brilliant. I'm really glad you're doing that, and it's lovely to have several platforms to your work, isn't it? So
yeah, I've enjoyed having different formats for it, and it kind of makes you revisit everything. And I guess explore the way you work again. The idea that something that's flat on the page as a book actually needs a bit of different treatment to get it off the page to be an audiobook. And that's and it's different again if it was for taking things to screens and stages and things like that. It's kind of that I love the idea of those kind of different rules in the different universes, I guess.
And has it done it for you, Arthur? Do you feel like you're having this writing life and this amazing sort of creative output? Has that managed to replace what you were missing when you had to make that change from leaving theatre?
It's replaced some of it, I think.
Yeah.
The creative kernel of that kind of tiny teeny nut of making something that wasn't there before, and doing that, I think, and really focusing all of your experience and all of the skills that you've amassed, and not anywhere near as many writing as I had doing lamping, but the idea that you use that and focus it on making something, I think is still there. Working in working in collaboration isn't there quite so much. I guess it's why I enjoyed the audio book so much. And, you know, so working in collaboration with other people and getting to, you know, chuck ideas around and things like that, I love.
That's the main difference for me. I think that's anyone that moves from sort of collaborative art to sort of solo, so, you know, becoming a writer or becoming a painter or something, it's when you're used to being in, I always say, you know, in a room with stretchy trousers with a load of other people, suddenly you're in a room on your own with your stretchy trousers. I mean, we're lucky to have had both of those experiences, of course, but I missed that as well. So I hear you. If it's not too large a question, that if in general you're feeling optimistic about the future, and if you as a sort of signing off, whether there's anything that you think that we could do, thinking about, you know, the ideas that we've talked about possible brighter future, more hope for the future. If there's anything that you and I or anyone listening might be able to do, small little thing that could lead us into a better future as we start this shiny new year.
Well, I think there's plenty to be hopeful about. I think that's I'm going to say that's a given of this year, but everyone doesn't look at the world the same way I do, so I guess it's not a given. But the big thing to have come out of this year, the two big things for me, one was the thing that I spoke to before about, you know, the idea that that this year has been totally dominated by people working together, by humans doing stuff together, which is brilliant. And that's been, you know, and I think that's only the start of people having that realization that all of us getting together and putting our heads together will just make incredible, beautiful things. And we've only just started to do that. We've started to do it because we've had to do it, but now we've done it because we've had to do it. Imagine what we could do if we, you know, if we wanted to do it, you know, or if we were driven by, you know, by joy and not fear, you know. So those kind of things are hugely hopeful. But the other thing is the science. So the idea that prior to this year, the quickest a vaccine has ever been developed was in 6 years for mumps. The mumps vaccine was developed in 6 years, and that was seen as a huge, staggering scientific breakthrough. And actually, you know, this time last year, we were just talking about the idea that this strange new thing might be happening in China. And it's not even been 12 months between then and us, you know, and us having an actual vaccine, you know. So the first doses were issued, you know, in the back end of December, weren't they? Oh no, back end of, was it November, the first ones? Well, they were announced in November, weren't they? And so the idea that you know, science and people using science have done that, I think, is amazing. You know, science doesn't have to be evil, and it doesn't have to be, you know, crazy scientists blowing things up. It, you know, it can be what it is, which is an inordinate number of really diligent, really hardworking people, you know, being brilliant, and doing all this stuff. Yeah,
because I think you know. So my sister's a scientist. She's at Imperial, and she would absolutely agree with you. Said, "God, this is sort of mad, you know, this trope of mad scientists with crazy hair." And my other friend is he's a cosmologist at Queen Mary's, and he talks about how scientists are always presented as this sort of lonely, slightly inhuman person. Actually, most scientific innovation and breakthroughs are groups of people working collaboratively together, and internationally as well, international groups of scientists. So I find really hopeful as well.
Yeah, that's one of my favourite things, I think, from this year. It's that whole huge thing. And also that you know, often science is seen as this kind of huge, rarefied thing that, you know, the thing that that made that stopped the pandemic in its tracks was people with 150 IQs decoding the genomic sequence of a novel virus. And actually, one of the things that slowed the pandemic down was nurses and healthcare professionals saying, actually, do you know what? These masks are really working. We should probably do some more of that. Let's get some science done and see if that really makes a difference. And then people started collecting all of that, and there was, then everybody got behind that idea. The newspapers were printing instead things saying, right, this barbers in New York had 30 people in it all day, all wearing masks. One of them had COVID, nobody else caught it. And everybody then immediately started going, oh, wow. And that's all still science. That's still using experiments to prove a hypothesis, and normal people could do it, and that's what makes it also brilliant, I think, is that, everyone has been able to play the part.
That is exactly it, isn't it? That's what we need to do, is to play our part, to contribute in whatever way we can. And in a way, like you said earlier, think about what we've done already and continue that. It's kind of more of the good stuff, isn't it?
It is. And that whole kind of, I think partly what I said before about the people caring for each other and about each other, and that's, mask wearing is part of that. And, but the other thing about, the caring for each other, recognizing that we are all, if we don't consider ourselves all to just be humans, all on the same floating, spinning ball of dirt, then the universe will remind us of that, in ever sharper fashions. If we're not going to heed that, that's what's going to happen. And that's what's happened during the pandemic. It's equalized all of us, all 7.5 billion of us. We're all scared of the same thing at the same time, and we can all do the same things to help fix it. So that's a beautiful thing to be taking into the new year. We can all do the same things and we're all experiencing the same thing. All of us, all 7.5 billion of us.
That's a lot of us. I don't care what you say.
Yeah.
Really, yeah. That's a beautiful thing to finish on. All right, my darling. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.